Hello everybody, welcome back to another Borderlands 2 video. Today we are going to be doing something a bit different, and that is actually going to be a tier list. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I've had some recommendations for it as well, and I thought it would be pretty fun. So for this case, we're going to be doing a tier list for assault rifles, and this is not going to be for the UCP. This is actually just going to be for vanilla. I'm just going to rank the assault rifles from a general consensus for all characters on the vanilla game. Now, eventually, I think doing it for the UCP and for individual characters would also be fun. So if that's something you guys are interested in, definitely let me know, and I could probably fit that in. But let's go ahead and rank the assault rifles on the vanilla game for all characters. So first of all, the Bearcat. The Bearcat, well, it receives some rather substantial buffs on the UCP, some damage and fire rate buffs, but without those buffs, it's rather weak and underwhelming. It consumes too much ammo, its damage and fire rate are also a bit on the low side. It's a bit underwhelming overall. I wouldn't. This is not a weapon that is really worth its rarity. It's a pearlescent weapon, and it's not exactly easy to get, but it's not good. Um, I wouldn't put it F tier because it's usable, but it's like for a pearlescent weapon, it's extremely disappointing, more or less. The UCP really helps this out, though. Okay, moving on though. Let's look at the Becca. So the Becca on the vanilla and the UCP, it doesn't really matter, is an amazing weapon. Extremely high damage. It splits off into 3 projectiles, so you can get benefits out of it with skills like chain reaction. It also benefits from the B for the same reason. It's pretty ammo efficient, high damage, high fire rate. It's accurate. It's pretty much everything you want in a Jacobs assault rifle. So I think this is honestly pretty firmly in the S tier. It's one of the best assault rifles in the game, and it doesn't matter what character you're playing. Maybe Salvador would be pretty bad with it because you want to be zooming in with this weapon. Uh, Other than that, though, I think genuinely any other character can make exceptional use of this weapon. Okay, so next up we have the Boom Puppy. Um, this is a weapon I've only really used a few times, and I've hated it because it is terrible. Um, to give you an idea, this weapon on the UCP got buffed by 190% its damage. That's how bad it was. That's a huge damage increase. I think that's one of the highest on there, actually. 190% damage increase. On top of that, it also got its fire rate increased, and it's still not even that great. But the Boom Puppy also does self-damage to just put the icing on the cake. So this weapon is firmly in the F tier on the vanilla game. It is horrific. I don't know why you would use this weapon unless you're just actively trying to make the game harder. Um, yeah, not good. The UCP definitely gives it a, breathes a little life into it, but it's still not an exceptional weapon. Okay, so next up we have the Choppa. This is another pretty awful weapon, to be honest, and the UCP doesn't even do much to fix it. It's a relatively low damage assault rifle, but it has a massive clip, and when you fire it, it doesn't stop firing. Like that's pretty much the whole gimmick. It just has an insanely high fire rate and a ton of bullets in the magazine. But it doesn't really matter how high your fire rate and magazine size is if you're doing no damage. This is another weapon I'd probably put in the F tier. It's pretty much unusable. It's horrifically bad. It doesn't do much damage. It's very ammo inefficient. You'll run out almost immediately. And probably the worst part about all of it is that it's going to take you, God knows, I mean, like just so many shots just to kill something. And you're already out of ammo when, you've killed like one enemy, basically. It's pretty pathetic. But anyway, moving on. The Damned Cowboy on Vanilla. Another weapon that I believe gets some love at the UCP. Let me check. Yeah, it does get. So the Damned Cowboy gets a 200% damage bonus and increases the critical hit damage bonus to 50%, but has 400 more or 400% more recoil. So The way that this weapon works in vanilla is it's supposed to be like a high damage Jacob's assault rifle, but its fire rate is like painfully slow. Um, and that's pretty much like the problem with it. Its fire rate is so bad and the damage isn't high enough to compensate for it. Like it doesn't even hit that hard on vanilla. Um, like hence the fact that it got a 200% damage buff on UCP. The fact that this weapon is supposed to be like a one shot, one kill kind of weapon, like very slow fire rate but high damage, and it can't even execute that makes it horrible. This is a very bad weapon. It's firmly in the F tier. Um, and just to take note, I will make an order here. So like if something is at the top of the F tier, it means it's like almost in D tier. And if something is at the bottom of F tier, it's the worst of the tier. As I have it now, honestly, the damn cowboy, it actually probably is the worst. I kind of like this order. I think they're all three pretty terrible. It's kind of hard to say which one's actually worse. I think they are super bad. You can at least get some kills maybe playing zero with this weapon, the damn cowboy. Like it does do decent damage. These other two are don't do damage and don't do anything else very well. So maybe we'll put it at the top of the F. Okay, another weapon that is not exactly great, the Evil Smasher. So if I'm correct, I think this is another weapon that's buffed in the UCB. Uh, I can't find it right now, but I'm almost positive that it gets a buff. Regardless, this is just kind of another meh choice. This one's a little bit more usable than the ones in the F tier, though. Its damage is not exactly impressive, but it does have like a chance to randomly proc a buff. Um, I forget the exact stats, but I think it's like some extra fire rate and damage and stuff like that when it does happen. And it procs by like basically if you just use it, like while you're using it, has a chance to proc this buff that gives you some damage and fire rate and stuff like that. I can't remember the exact numbers or what it does, but um, it's another one that's pretty meh. It's not. It's not. I don't think it's nearly as bad as some of the ones in the F tier, though. Like you could probably make some use out of it, but I definitely use the Bearcat over it. It's pretty bad overall. Not great. Not great. Okay, moving on. Honestly, as I'm looking through the rest of this list, most of these look pretty good. There's a few terrible ones and meh ones, but these look better. Okay. Anyway, moving on. The hail. Um, I think the hail pretty much has to be S tier or close, especially when we compare it to its relative competition. Um, the hail is leagues above, honestly, just about everything left, with the exception of about one or two weapons, maybe. So I think it's still behind the Becca because the Becca is just such a great weapon and high damage, but I don't know, it's actually tough. Um, actually, you know what? I think the hail is the best assault rifle. Period, actually, now that I'm thinking about this more. Just from a general perspective, I think maybe if we're discussing Axton, then we have more of an argument. But just from a generalist perspective, every single character can use the hail, and every single character can get so much out of it. Its firing arc is annoying to use, and I think that's what some people would knock it for. But if you can just get used to it, even a little bit, its fire rate is amazing. Its spread is nice if you can get used to it, and if you aim down sights properly, its spread's actually pretty good. Um, it's high damage, it's high fire rate, the recoil is not bad, and it's a moxie weapon, so you lifesteal, and it also has split projectiles, which means it massively benefits from the B. And on top of that, it gets grenade damage. This is just an extremely well-rounded weapon, and if you can learn to master it, it will reward you. It is very, very powerful. But moving on, we have the Hammer Buster. This is just like a shittier version of the Becca and like other Jacob's assault rifles, basically. It's similar concept to the Becca where it's the Gatling gun where it's high damage, you fire it fast, pretty accurate, good burst damage. but it just doesn't come close to the level of DPS that the Becca provides. It's not a terrible weapon though. I think it's almost like the definition of meh. Like it's not bad. It's just not great. Um, we'll go ahead and move on. So the Kerblaster, I think the Kerblaster's pretty good on every character. Like I said, I don't think there's a single character where it's like bad. Like it's pretty solid. It has the extra grenade damage from the child grenade, which immensely benefits Axton. It's also really good on Krieg with all of his explosive damage buffs. And I think he has some grenade damage buffs as well. Yeah. So on Krieg and Axton, I'd say this is probably an S tier, or at least close to it. But from a general perspective, where there's a lot of characters that don't really benefit from explosive damage, um, it, it's not as good. So I think I'd put it A tier. It's still really good on just about any character, but if we're specifically looking at Axton and Krieg, I think it would be S tier. Okay. Next, we have the Kitten. Kitten is another really good Moxie assault rifle. I really like this weapon. It's more of like a shotgun than it is an assault rifle. You really want to get into people's faces and just spray. This is another weapon where you can use it on any character and you'll be happy with the results. It's extremely well rounded, and it's just really good. I don't think I can justify it in the S tier though. It's a really high A tier, like maybe like an A plus. I don't think it's quite on the level of the Hail or Becca, but it's pretty, and I think that mostly comes down to its limitations of its range. It's only good in close range, and its fire rate or its spread is just completely abysmal from long range. So I think that limitation sets it back a little bit, whereas these two are pretty much good anywhere. Like the Becca's not awesome close range, but you can at least get something out of it. Whereas the Kitten, if you're long range, you will get nothing out of it. For the next weapon, though, I keep getting these two mixed up. Okay, that's the Shred of Fire over here. This is the Lead Storm. The Lead Storm is another good assault rifle, actually. This is another one that has a bit of a weird spread. It is actually similar to the Hail, where it's like these arcing projectiles. So you have to kind of master the technique of it. But it has all these extra projectiles. So immediately that means it benefits immensely from the B. This is a weapon that can shred through bosses and even raid bosses if used correctly. For general mobbing, it's not that bad either because of its insanely high fire rate and high magazine size. I'd actually say that the Lead Storm is a bit on the underrated side. It's pretty good, but can churn through ammo a little bit too quickly at times, and also has range limitations because unlike the Hail where the spread's a little bit tighter, with the arc volley, the arc kind of goes everywhere. You do need to be pretty close unless you're shooting a raid boss that is big. So I think for those reasons I'd put it in the B tier. Next we have the Madhouse. I can't. The Madhouse gets an indirect buff from the UCP with the Bandit assault rifle buffs. Even then, it's not great. This weapon's not good. It's not good. And this is coming from someone that's extensively tested it on Gage and Maya. It can work on both of those characters, but it requires so much setup just to make it okay that it's not worth it. You have to pump a lot of points into like chain reaction and these different kind of skills just to make it viable. And for that reason, I think it's in the D tier. Like it's usable, but it takes too much setup and too much time just to make it okay. It's just kind of a clunky weapon that its damage is too low. Next, we have the Ogre. I think this is a pretty easy S tier. I don't know if I'd put it above the Becca or the Hail because of its limitations on other characters. If we're talking about Axton or Krieg, it's probably the best. But if we're talking about every character, I don't think that's the case. The Ogre is really high fire, really high damage weapon. It has the potential to shoot 2 shots at the cost of 1. Very high fire rate, very high damage, great magazine size. It's an exceptional weapon, but it is an explosive weapon, so other characters won't get as much out of the Ogre as Axton and Krieg would. But it's still really good, so I want it in the S tier. This one's kind of interesting. The Rapier, I don't think is really even fair to compare to these weapons. Um, just because it's like you don't use it for a gun. Um, if we're talking about the Rapier from a purely melee standpoint, it's obviously S tier. But if we're talking about it from, you know, using it as a gun, it's an obvious F tier. It's horrendous. It is a terrible gun. I'm not even really going to get into that. So I think for this, for the purposes of this video, we are talking about them as a gun. So I think the Rapier is easily the worst gun here. It's god awful. But again, for melee, S tier. Next we have the Saw Bar. Now the Saw Bar is maybe a bit underrated, underappreciated actually. I think this weapon's actually really good. It's really really good on Axton. Even though it doesn't benefit from grenade damage, it just does such high damage, and the turrets allow, well, the turrets soak up the aggro, which allows you to get into the proper range to use this weapon to its fullest capacity. But this weapon does really, really good damage. You just have to understand the sweet spot. If you're not in the right range, then you won't get the splash bonus. It won't burst out and create all of the other pellets and explosions. So I think for like I want to put it in S tier just because it's a personal favorite, but I definitely can't do that. This weapon is probably B or A tier simply because if you're not in the proper range, like where this weapon excels, it's terrible. If you're close or too far, if you're too close or too far, I should say, this weapon sucks. But if you're in that perfect sweet spot, it's amazing. So I think for that reason, I think it has more DPS capability than the Leadstorm if used properly. But again, both of these weapons suffer from range disadvantages. They need a particular setup to excel. But when they are put in the proper position to excel, they destroy. Okay, next we have the Scorpio. Um, this gets some pretty substantial buffs in the UCP, and it's honestly still not even that good. So that should tell you enough. It's another one of these weapons that is just extremely meh. It's not. I think it's firmly in the D tier. I'd put it below the Bearcat. Honestly, even below the Madhouse, because if you use the Madhouse properly, it can at least do something. The Scorpio is just very meh. Like, it'll do okay damage, has okay fire rate, okay mag size, all that stuff. But it just doesn't really excel at anything. It's just kind of there. Like, you never really want to prioritize this weapon over anything. Next up, we have the Seeker. Um, this weapon gets some huge buffs on the UCP. It's still not even that good, even with gauge. Basically, the whole purpose of this weapon is it seeks out targets for you, and the only way that you would possibly justify this weapon is if you have like 600 anarchy stacks with gauge and you just don't want to aim, and it'll kill things for you. But even with 600 anarchy stacks or like 400 with the Seeker, like it's not that impressive. Like, I'd rather just have the conference call, the fibber, um, pretty much any other multiple projectile weapon. Like the Seeker is a massive disappointment of a weapon, and its damage and fire rate are just so abysmal. Um, I guess I'll give it. I mean, I can't really justify putting it below these two because these two just kind of suck. They're just okay. I'll put it next to the Madhouse because if the Seeker is put in a proper position with gauge, it can at least do something. But generally speaking, this weapon is awful. Basically, gauge puts this in D tier. If we exclude gauge, this is easily the worst weapon next to the Rapier. I would say it's terrible. Next up, we have the Seraphim. Um, this weapon gets some huge buffs on the UCP, and it's actually really good. But without the UCP, it's just kind of another. It's an option. It's not good. It's not terrible. It's just kind of mediocre. I think I'd probably want it above the Bearcat. I think it's low, a low C tier. Not very impressive, but not horrible. Next, we have the Shreddifier. Um, this is very similar to the Saw Bar and the Lead Storm, unsurprisingly, where if you put this weapon in the right position to succeed, it will shred enemies. But if you are not in the perfect range or the perfect area to use it, it will suck. So honestly, I think the Lead Storm and the Shreddifier are interchangeable. I'll give the Lead Storm the edge because I think it gets a huge boost from the B that you can abuse with all the with all the extra projectiles, I should say. So I think I'll give it the edge there, but they're both really good if you can put them in the position to succeed, is how I would put it. All right, only three more here. We've got the Stinkpot. Stinkpot's pretty bad. It gets a damage buff in the UCP. On vanilla, though, we are talking about a extremely mediocre Jacob's weapon. The damage sucks. The fire rate's okay, I guess, because of the Gatling mechanic. You know, you can spam it, but it doesn't matter how high your fire rate is when the damage is completely abysmal. Um, I mean, I'd obviously take it over the Rapier as a gun, but I'd pretty much put it in this Choppa territory. Probably right around here behind the damned cowboy. They're both really bad. All right, so we have the Varuk, and I literally can't remember the name of this weapon. I've only used it a few times. What is it called? Let me look. That's right, the Stomper. Um, yeah, okay. So this weapon, I think, basically the whole gimmick is that it's supposed to do increased critical hit damage, but I think it has lower base damage than most Jacob's assault rifles. But the problem is on vanilla, I don't think the extra critical hit damage even works. So it's basically just a worse version of other Jacobs assault rifles. You'd be better off with just like a random purple Jacobs assault rifle or something of that sort, which means it's pretty pathetic. I'd put it below the other Jacobs ones. I think these three are almost in a tier of their own with how bad they are. Yeah, I think that's about right. And then we have the Varuk. The Verruckt is sort of a personal favorite of mine. It's not like the strongest weapon, but I think there's more than a few characters that can bring out the potential of this weapon. It's got great fire rate, very good damage, especially if you're up close, good magazine size, pretty good accuracy. Excuse me. I think this is just a pretty well-rounded weapon, but again, this is another weapon that does have some range limitations, um, but nowhere near as severe as like the saw bar and these other weapons. So I think I'd put it at the bottom of A tier. I think it's a very well-rounded weapon, and even on vanilla, I think it's a bit underrated actually. On the UCP, I think it's actually closer to S tier. It's really good. So yeah, guys, that's pretty much every weapon. I've totally forgot to include the rainbow quality weapons. I just realized that. So I think the only two assault rifles in that tier are the Toothpick and the Peak Opener, and both are easily S tier. They're disgustingly good, especially the Peak Opener. The Peak Opener is the best assault rifle in the game. It does a ridiculous amount of damage, and it synergizes so well with more than a few characters, so it is disgusting. The Toothpick is more of a raid boss killer. It's not very ammo efficient, but its damage output is insane, and its ability to melt raid bosses, I think, easily puts it in the S tier as well. It's just a very good gun. So yeah, I know I forgot to include those two, but they're S tier. They're really good, and they're both probably the top of S tier. I'd put the Toothpick closer to the Becca, probably below it, but the Peak Opener would be the top of S tier because it is just honestly busted how strong that thing is. Okay, so yeah, that was a bit of a longer video, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you next time.